You think about the takeaways from 2024 and how people can, overlearn a lesson. I think having veterans perform well in 2024 is something that is going to hurt a lot of drafters in 2025. And certainly that goes across a variety of positions. One of the things that's just incredibly important to focus on is how well did the player actually play last year? And that's a big problem for guys like Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp.
Continuing to dissect the expert ADP from a fantasy football draft over the last couple of days. That is what we're doing here on RotoViz Overtime today. We worked through rounds 1 to 3 and picked out some of the areas where we thought were most intriguing and challenging in ADP this season, and some of the decisions that you have to make while on the clock in these sort of situations. It is a PPR format. We are going to go now through maybe jumping between rounds to the other areas that we find most interesting with such a high-end caliber of drafter in this draft, and the decisions that they were making and pulling players in certain directions in terms of their ADP. Shawn, we are looking at your team so far. You are Malik Neighbors, Trey McBride, Xavier Worthy, and then you do take Ted McMillan in the 4th round. We won't dive into the analysis of your particular pick because I do want to plug the episode that I have recorded with Ben Gretsch, which will come out on Wednesday, where we go through the best picks of every round in fantasy this year. Spoiler alert, Ted McMillan was one of those names that came up. So anyone looking for Ted McMillan content, I will push you in the way of the RotoViz Fantasy Football podcast and check out that edition. But Shawn, as we get in here to this kind of zone of the draft, it's where you start to see quarterbacks getting drafted and picked up. Some of those tight ends that I mentioned that I think that are undervalued, underpriced, they are going in this particular area of the draft. When we look at Kittle, LaPorta, and TJ Hawkinson. When we're in this 4th round again, the between mid-3rd, late 4th, I feel like it's the QBs, question marks, and then certain profiles that we want to draft. And even in those profiles that we're talking about, there may be some question marks as well. But that is like you took them in the 3rd round, but Xavier Worthy, Jameson Williams, Kittle, Ted McMillan, the QBs, Devontae Smith. But I think when we get into this range, I'm almost looking to, that 5th round, and I want to get 2 of those 5th round guys. How are you feeling about how this particular round of the draft played out here, how the ADP is setting up for this season when we're into round 4? Because I do think that kind of, we talk about the 16 picks that could be round 1 picks. I feel like at this point, there's pretty much like 16 picks that could be, round 5 picks that are going from round 3 to 4.
It's a fascinating area. I talked about not liking the wide receivers in round 3 on the previous show, but also at the same time not liking the running backs in round 4. So if you don't like the wide receivers in round 3, you don't like the running backs in round 4, you don't necessarily have that option of pulling some of those guys up necessarily. Now you could go just way off the map ADP wise, but then people will accuse you of thinking you know better than like everyone else in the draft community. I mean, that's fine. You can do that some too. It's one of the reasons why I do think that you want to commit some tactical reaches in your drafts so you can actually select multiple players from a slightly more fertile range, as opposed to tie yourself down to thinking like every draft I do, I've got to take some of these guys in rounds 3 and round 4 that I don't really like, but just because those are the ADP values. Now you should take them sometimes, right? You want to have the humility to understand that maybe you are wrong. And when it comes to myself personally, I know I'm going to be wrong on many occasions, but you think about those running backs in round 5 there of Hampton, Walker, Henderson, and Harvey. I think that those 4 picks there are just simply objectively straight up better than the 4 running backs going in round 4. I think that's an interesting note from this range. My favorite pick from round 4, which is something that we have been talking about a little bit, was the Jaden Daniels selection. Colm, I have Daniels ranked as the number 1 QB. It's been interesting because we talked about a couple of Mike's picks as being controversial. We talked about his Gibbs pick as maybe being the best pick in the 1st round. He's got this huge stretch here where his picks are either like just straightforwardly the best pick in the round, like Kenneth Walker again in round 5, or picks were like, Mike drafts in a different way than we do. He's very, very good. And so it is always fun, especially when you're drafting right next to him, like I was in this draft, to see where he goes. I mean, about half the rounds really in the first 10 rounds. He's got the best pick. And then the build is different. Now, he's had some success with these builds, so we'll see what happens here. But I thought it was awesome that he went out there and took Jaden Daniels as the first QB. Now, you don't know how quickly the other guys are going to follow on behind, but it was a full half round as it worked out ahead of Lamar Jackson. We also had, I thought, a pretty fun pick by Rummy in round 5, where he takes Joe Burrow ahead of Jalen Hurts. Colm, I really hate it that I am on the hybrid QB bandwagon, but the evidence just really pushes you in that direction. So even though I think that Joe Burrow is going to have another huge season, I think that Jalen Hurts has a lot of question marks. It's a controversial pick. I love going ahead and making that selection, though. I do think that you have a lot of risk of getting hit with the same problems that Patrick Mahomes has given his drafters in the last couple of years, where maintaining that type of passing season in this environment is just so hard. But when you look at Joe Burrow and having Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, you look at Mayfield, and Mayfield has a lot of weapons. It'll be interesting to see what they do now in this third year, again, with a different coordinator. But if you're going to be making pass-oriented picks at QB, I do really enjoy that Rummy was willing to go out there and make that pick, had the guts to do it with Hurts still on the board. And at this point, I took, so to spoil what happens a little bit later, I take Rashad Bateman in round 9, in part because I didn't think that Luther Burden would fall to me in round 11. I had a couple of picks that I would like back because my gaming out of what I thought would subsequently happen turned out to be wrong. And that's something you always want to keep in mind as well. Now, a lot of people are drafting with 20-second clocks, and you don't have a lot of time to necessarily go through like each individual pick and be like, I think this drafter is going to need this and do this. And so 2 rounds later, this is going to happen. Slow drafts can be both an opportunity to work through some of those things, to sharpen your process and how you want to tactically approach things, not just for future slow drafts and not just for the slow draft you're in, but even though you maybe don't have the time to work through all of the scenarios in a fast draft, but you just have it kind of built in as your rules of thumb that these are things that are likely to be the case and I want to be a step ahead of them. At the same time, you can game it all out and look at the probabilities. And then if something that is a little bit less likely hits, if that causes you problems because you really did build around a certain scenario, then you want to be aware of how that's not good, right? Your selections can't be so fragile that if you get a different opportunity later, you're like, oh, well, that makes the other pick a mistake. But basically, I passed on Patrick Mahomes in round 9 for Bateman because I thought that the way that the wide receiver cliff would work out, that was an important pick. In retrospect, and especially as I mentioned on the previous show, having completed the 7,000 word article on the Chiefs, I don't think that you can pass on Patrick Mahomes in the middle of round 9.
When we look at some players who may come in surprising ADP, somebody that you kind of touched on when we did our draft episode a week or so ago was Keon Coleman. He goes in this draft in a pretty interesting spot. I thought the other player that kind of fits into that mold would have been a Jalen Warren. Both players who we kind of like in certain ways. I would be more on the Warren side than the Coleman side, but Coleman went as the wide receiver 43 in this particular draft, and Warren went as the RB 25. Both of them kind of about 2 rounds ahead of ADP. One of them to Rummy, who we touched on a moment ago, and then Warren going to Denny Carter. Any thoughts on those two guys? Is that kind of around where you have them ranked, or would you be reluctant to draft them at those prices?
Well, I had mentioned that I would have taken Sam LaPorta as my second tight end in round 6 because Sam LaPorta should not be at that price, right? It doesn't really even matter if you're thinking about the way the yardage and catch scoring works or the way the touchdown scoring works. Sam LaPorta shouldn't be there. But the fallback for me was that I had a pretty decent sense that TJ Hawkinson is going to come back to my selection in round 7. And then you maybe have a similar profile even around cheaper. And that's important because I selected Jordan Addison. Colm, you probably know a lot more than I do about what the discussion is in the wider fantasy community on him. My thought is that he's going to be suspended, and people probably are aware that he's going to be suspended, and they think that they're factoring that into the price on him. And yet when it does happen, if the announcement comes before the season starts, then he's going to really crater in price, because this idea that it's factored in versus the reality of it being there in front of you and everybody being like, well, now how long can we wait? I mean, he's going to fall more, right? So then it kind of comes into like, how high do you think he should be going if you don't have a suspension factored in, which I would argue is probably the end of round 4. And so then once you get in round 6, and Jerry Jeudy was the player who went right before that, I think that you would certainly prefer Jeudy, maybe for a variety of reasons. But between Addison and that Hawkinson pick, the receivers that went were Olave, Shakir, Myers, Samuel, Jaden Reed, Keon Coleman, and Cooper Kupp. And so what we have is sort of a mini cliff right after Addison. There are still some names that we like through there. We like Jaden Reed. We like Josh Downs. I think that there certainly is some reason to feather in some Matthew Golden onto your rosters. I come back and take Michael Pittman in round 8. That's one that as we really start to move in the direction of it looking like Daniel Jones will be the starter, then Michael Pittman just becomes, massively undervalued. Even if you're sort of a Michael Pittman skeptic, which I am, you're like, wide receiver 50 is kind of silly there. Coleman in that group, I think, is probably the right spot. I have him ranked just slightly ahead of ADP in the various things that I have put out so far. I don't think that you want to approach him in the same way as an Addison or a Reed or a Downs, where you probably want a lot of exposure, but I think that you do want some. He was an overvalued or an overrated player where he was selected. One of the things that comes up when you work through what happened in last year's draft is that there is some attention on the fact that in retrospect, the gap between Brian Thomas and Xavier Worthy, it seems like it's very large, right? And even as a Xavier Worthy fan, I think that you're like, yeah, I mean, the gap looks like it's really big. The thing that maybe gets a little bit less, not necessarily even like people don't realize that because the ADPs, suggest this very strongly, but there was a huge gap between Worthy and then that group of guys who came immediately after him in Xavier Legette, Keon Coleman, and then including Ladd McConkey, even though McConkey is hit, right? Just because someone did hit and got, a 99th percentile outcome in terms of what their profile was, doesn't mean that there wasn't a gigantic gap before you then have all the new information, right? And so when we think about Coleman and where he was as a prospect and then where he was as a rookie, and his rookie season is controversial because it actually does look like he was about to take off before he got hurt. And then you miss all that time, you come back and you play a couple of games that are sort of Quentin Johnston-ish. We're like, man, he got a lot of targets and no production, right? And then you're not that involved in the playoffs, and people are like, okay, well, it's just a Khalil Shakir offense. It's going to be Shakir. He's going to have a bunch of those 3-yard targets. The other targets are going to be soaked up potentially by guys like Joshua Palmer and Elijah Moore. Maybe Dalton Kincaid is a little bit more efficient. They're going to throw to the backs. Coleman's going to get some deep targets. He's going to have some explosive plays. He's going to have a few games where probably he's in your starting lineup just because of like a one-play touchdown. But his profile and what happened in his rookie year, and even then the reports out of camp where supposedly, depending on who you listen to, he's a rising star or the same problems that he's always had, were there. And people are like, if he's going to be a star, you'd like for him to just absolutely dominate padless practices at this juncture in the summer. Again, I think that he's probably priced in about the right range, but he is one of these guys where because you're probably going to get the spike weeks, that in best ball, I think he probably doesn't hurt you that much. And there is still this possibility, even with all those negatives that I mentioned, that, I mean, we get rocket ship Coleman at some point this year, and you're like, yeah, I mean, that was the pick you had to make.
Yeah, and obviously there's like the question marks about where he was drafted and the profile and everything around that. But we talked about this, and it may be a year since we talked about it, but like in dynasty circles, let's say 8 to 10 years ago, there was always like, it's going to take these guys a few years to get everything together. We look back to like a Devontae Adams or a Keaton Allen, some of those kind of names. Whereas now it's just like, yeah, get on the scrap heap and we're on to the next guy. And there is a chance that some of these names do have that, post-rookie breakout in some of these situations. And he's somebody who, by ADP and Underdog, went in the 9th round in this draft. As I mentioned, he went in the 7th round. But I think there's a range of outcomes as to where that hits in a pretty good way. You mentioned the Jordan Addison thing. I think the expectation is that he's going to be suspended. You mentioned his price will drop after that. I kind of think that his price is already factoring in a lot of that when we look at like where he's going and some of the players that are going around him. But the more and more like you look through full draft boards of ADP rather than like players that you're like prioritizing by round. I mentioned sometimes when we're doing these drafts, they'll send you a kind of a layout of what we might get from a specific draft slot as the draft progresses. But going through these boards, there's so many names that I just feel like, how is this player going in this range? But that is where the general ADP is set, and then in this draft, a lot of it following kind of some of the same layout. One player, Shawn, you didn't mention being on after that Jordan Addison pick was Chris Olave. Another plug for that show with Ben that we talked about. We had a real fun discussion with Chris Olave, and feel like we both are intrigued at those particular prices. But as we move on through some of the additional picks coming up here, I'm going to kind of leave the door open for you, but I feel like there's, stuck more to that ADP that we are seeing obviously delivered throughout the kind of best ball universe at this particular point in time, with how things are set up and how things are looking. Not as many outliers as in those previous years, but I kind of touched on the veteran wide receivers in the last show. And I think that's an area of this year's draft where we often talk about the wide receiver dead zone, the running back dead zone. I feel like there's a lot of potential dead zone wide receivers hanging around in these opening 10 rounds, with that veteran group. But somebody who, you talk there about what the wider aspect is in the social media community around Jordan Addison. A lot of positive buzz at the moment, Shawn, for Stefon Diggs. And it does look like his recovery has gone very well coming back from his injury. There was also maybe not so positive buzz around Deebo Samuel over the last 2 weeks with maybe some of his conditioning or lack of condition and Commanders camp. But there's some names that are going here that you can see their names have continued to slide down draft boards year on year on year over the last couple of years. And if we were treating them in the same way that we treat some of these veteran running backs, like they just would be completely off the board. But Stefon Diggs, Deebo Samuel, both going in round 7. We're hoping that they can help their young quarterbacks, because we're both excited about May. Well, I think I might be more excited about May than Shawn, but May and obviously Jaden Daniels, who we touched on that previous episode. There's quite a few names going in this area where you're kind of like, one of them, the range of outcomes feels like they're being positioned at the top end of that. And then we look at some of the names like a Jaden Reed, for example, where we're kind of positioning those names at the bottom end of that range of ADP, or maybe a Josh Downs where the upside hasn't been priced in at all, but we're factoring in all the negative potential outcomes. Whereas I feel like some of these veteran wide receivers are being priced here because we're like, they used to be good. Is that too strong of a thought on some of those names that maybe should be going, I don't know, 3 to 4 rounds later?
3 to 4 rounds might be a stretch, but certainly you and I are on the same page that we see those picks and we're like, man, I mean, aging is a huge part of how teams have to manage their reality rosters. It's a huge part of fantasy football. And, you think about the takeaways from 2024 and how people can, overlearn a lesson. I think having veterans perform well in 2024 is something that is going to hurt a lot of drafters in 2025. And certainly that goes across a variety of positions. One of the things that's just incredibly important to focus on is how well did the player actually play last year? And that's a big problem for guys like Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp. We don't have that much information because of the injury for Stefon Diggs, but as I mentioned earlier, the injuries are a huge problem for these veteran wide receivers. I mean, massive red flags. The thing that I want to mention here that does factor into this draft, we talked about how some of the scoring is a little bit different, what have you. This is just a full season most points format. And a full season most points format is going to be different in that the young players who might help you win a tournament because they are scoring a lot more points in the sort of individual tournament weeks of 15, 16, 17, that doesn't come into play. The young players who might help you in a 3-week sprint because they're the highest scorers in the playoffs, that doesn't come into play. You need full season points. And I do think that we are seeing the impact of that in a big way with how this draft was prosecuted by a lot of people, including myself, right? I really tried to push myself to draft veterans to make sure that I would have the full season points and to set up for picks that I knew were going to be more contingency based later. If you end up making an entire roster that is young players, you're going to have those hits, and then you're simultaneously going to have so many holes that the holes swamp your good scoring.
I will say, though, that those players are like where their underdog ADP generally is. Like they're within 6 picks of pretty much all of those names.
And so I guess what I'm saying is that I think that these drafters
are okay to do that.
Well, I think it's a little bit different.
It's more acceptable in this format than it is.
It's more acceptable.
So that means that the other ADP is even more egregious when you get to like the underdog drafts.
Oh my gosh. The other ADP is so egregious. Coleman, the one, it is funny here though. And I don't think Scott would mind me giving him a hard time at all. I've always been the Diggs guy. Every time that he and I do a show together, he's always giving me a hard time about Diggs. And I mean, he was certainly explaining to me that the Bills had moved on from Diggs after he was so bad in the second half of the 2023 season because they had reason to believe that he was washed. After a season where he misses most of it to injury with the Texans, and frankly was just like fine, right? He didn't look done last year, but he certainly didn't look like peak Stefon Diggs. Not somebody.
He looked like somebody who could be used in like a limited role. Yeah. You know, get him in the slot and give him some quick slants, but it didn't look like they were going to be like, this guy's going to get all over the field.
So then you're out partying on a boat doing your Darius Geis impersonation. I don't know. I mean, it's awesome for them if he's looked good in practice. That is something that they need. The whole Patriots thing, I think, is fascinating. You mentioned me not being that high on Drake May, and that's probably accurate. When you go back and look at his college numbers, I do think that some of what people are seeing there is aspirational in the same way that now it's to a very different degree than with Anthony Richardson. But I think it's certainly the case that people look at May and are like, well, if he hits, then you've got a really fun profile, which is a little bit different than saying like, he's going to hit, he's a star. And then he goes out and he had a terrible rookie season, right? His rookie numbers were bad. His peripherals were along the line with Caleb Williams, where everybody's like, Caleb Williams now is not as valuable as Bo Nix. And Caleb Williams, even with Ben Johnson and even with all of these receivers, we still have huge questions about. It's like, well, we should have questions about Drake May because he does not have receivers. And even though the Patriots have now massively upgraded the coaching staff, it's an upgrade where you're still like, I mean, the Patriots have the coaching staff version of like Deebo Samuel or Cooper Kupp or Stefon Diggs, where you're like, you know, if it were 2017, you'd be like, and that's actually a little bit early for some of those guys. If it were 2020, you'd be really excited to have this coaching staff. In 2025, you're like, I mean, it's an upgrade. But I should say that given the fact that there's a wide range of outcomes and there is reason to have some excitement for what the ceiling is, for what the raw talent is for someone like a Drake May, and then you do have just improved competency from the coaching staff. Colm, what would you have done there in round 5? I mentioned I like all of those picks. The TreVeyon Henderson thing for me is weird. I have a much higher grade on him than basically anybody else. I have him way ahead of ADP. I've actually moved his ranking just way down so that it's not so far off of ADP, so that subscribers don't actually, or don't, accidentally take him like 3 rounds before they need to. But if Drake May takes a step forward and Josh McDaniels does a fine job coordinating this offense, I mean, TreVeyon Henderson is Jahmyr Gibbs. He's Alvin Kamara. We know what those guys did as rookies with Mark Ingram in place, with David Montgomery in place. And Ramondre Stevenson is no Mark Ingram or David Montgomery. I mean, Ramondre Stevenson is just a guy. But we don't anticipate the Patriots scoring the way that Saints offense scored or the way the Lions offense can score. How do you kind of work through the scenarios, the pricing, and what you think are realistic expectations for this Patriots team when we think about Drake May having probably both a high ceiling and maybe a low floor?
Yeah, I think that the way, if it's a case that the team is bad again, I could see a scenario where like there's a lot of like catch up time, a lot of dump off passes. You're also going to have Stevenson in the mix as well, but you could get a pretty good floor from that aspect. The other part, and it's kind of hard to see with the Patriots at the moment, but if May takes a step forward and let's say we're wrong on Diggs and he is healthy and does enough, let's say he does the Adam Thielen role from last season for the Panthers, and then Kyle Williams is relatively okay, Hunter Henry does okay. Like the team, I don't expect it to be like in the top third of scoring in the NFL, but they could get to middle of the pack. And if that there is something that could come into that range of outcomes, I think then Henderson becomes very interesting. One of the things that we were frustrated with some of the teams that we had Drake May on last year was the fact that as the season went on, the Patriots were so bad, they were like, we kind of have to protect him a little bit. We're not going to have him out there rushing. You mentioned like Anthony Richardson. We don't expect him to be like that, but he does have some of that rushing capabilities. With Henderson, you kind of might have that little bit of fear that maybe they do some design runs down at the goal line that, get him either scrambling out to try and pass, or we've seen it with Bo Nix, or even going back, Shawn, to Sam Howell in his glory days with the Washington Commanders. We've seen him, have some of those design passing plays that then led to scrambles into the end zone. So some of that could affect Henderson's potential upside. But then when you go into the profile and the stuff that you've talked about there, when we look at the other players that go in this range, it's another kind of area where I feel like there is a tier break. Kenneth Walker went 1 pick ahead of him. I would probably have a tough decision deciding between both of those if they're available when we're on the clock. The other one was RJ Harvey, went the next running back off the board 3 picks later. You mentioned there in the previous show, Jalen Hurts and how he becomes interesting there. He went in that zone. But we look at, the veterans again, when we pair it all together. Cortland Sutton, who I thought had a nice bounce back last year, but you have Chris Godwin coming back from the injury. Joanne Jennings, who had a really strong year last year, but will that be able to continue? Jalen Waddle, who has continued to kind of flatter to deceive. Roma Dunze, pretty disappointing rookie year. Calvin Ridley is what he is. And then it's down to Jerry Jeudy, who is one of your guys. But when we work through, Shawn, there's kind of an area there where there's not a huge amount of appetizing names to add to the roster. So I think when we kind of rank those players out, for me, it's probably between him and RJ Harvey to draft at that particular slot, unless you were going to pull up Jerry Jeudy into that range. So I think in the 5th round, it's a fine pick. I think that the Patriots outlook, again, has been kind of priced at that negative point. I think if we thought the Patriots offense was going to be fantastic, he's probably going, at that, I would say in the RB15 range there, around earlier where Alvin Kamara is going, if we thought the offense was going to be better. That will be how I would be pricing it. So I like to think that the teams may maybe better than people are expecting. But I find that area of the draft between those three running backs, and I'm starting to come around more and more on Walker entering this season.
Colm, you're playing one league with $100,000 entry and winner take all for about $1 million. So ADP
draft Jerry Judy there at that spot.
I like it. I like it. ADP value, none of that comes into play at all. We now know that Colm's going to take Jerry Judy. Omarion Hampton, Kenneth Walker, TreVeyon Henderson, RJ Harvey, all four are available to you. Who do you select?
I think I'm going to go with Kenneth Walker. Again, plug for the show that I did with Ben. Kenneth Walker came up in that as well. Good conversation around the scenarios for this season and how that could play out. The one that I think out of those guys who has kind of the potential to go completely wild this season, I think is Walker.
He's a fun pick.
So we are going to close it out there on this edition of RotoViz OT. We worked our way through some of the rounds of the MFL10 of Death, some fun conversations around certain players, certain areas of the draft, and hopefully that'll help as you work your way through drafts this offseason and working your way towards the NFL season. If you want to sign up over at RotoViz, you can use the promo code RVRadio2025 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount off a RotoViz NFL pass. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime Ireland. You can check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.